Fernanda, welcome back everyone to our next session. Thank you to everyone who's been part of our session so far today. We've had some excellent questions and comments in the chat box, so please do continue that throughout this session. I'm absolutely delighted that we're starting to look beyond Wales in this session. This morning we had a huge focus on Wales, on the strategy and the action plans, and also some of the data from our friends at Crisis and Heriot-Watt University. This afternoon we're expanding our vision across Great Britain, and we're absolutely delighted to be welcoming back the Centre for Homelessness Impact, who have spoken at some of our conferences before. Today we'll be welcoming Rob Anderson and Eric Rees, who will be telling us about the What Works community, their initiative with local authorities across Great Britain, where they're looking at the tools and techniques that they're needed to tackle homelessness in those different local authority areas. We're really excited to hear about this. I think that this will be really useful, particularly for our partners in local authorities who are developing their housing support strategies as we speak. I'm sure there's lots that we can learn from the work that the Centre for Homelessness Impact has been doing. As I said, please do submit your questions in the panel. You'll see the chat panel on the right hand side, and there is a specific Q&A section to that. We do have about 15 or 20 minutes at the end for questions, so please do submit those to Rob and Eric. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Rob and Eric to deliver their presentation. Welcome to our Homelessness Symposium. Really looking forward to the session. Diolch yn fawr.
Thank you very much, Katie, and Prinhanda, everyone. I'm pretty sure I pronounced that wrong, but I just want to say thank you for having us to this super event. It's a real privilege to be here and to speak to you all. As Katie just said, I'm Rob Anderson. I lead the implementation arm of the Centre for Homelessness Impact. That means our work to build capacity across the homelessness sector, to use evidence and data better to accelerate an end to homelessness. So we've been asked to speak a bit about our work with local areas across the country today, focusing on our What Works community programme. It's always going to have a special connection with Wales, the What Works community programme, because one of our founding members was Pembrokeshire Council. So always very, very happy to speak to colleagues in Wales. I'm very happy we've also got Eric here alongside me to talk about the work of the What Works community, because Eric has been working on the programme since the very beginning, and also comes from an extensive background working in the US in capacity building and public services to kind of accelerate the kind of outcome change that we want to see for issues like homelessness. So very briefly, who are we? We're the What Works Centre for Homelessness. What does that mean? As a What Works Centre, we work to make the best available evidence on what's most effective, available to people who are making decisions, but also delivering services to people across the country and trying to help them achieve the greatest impact. So in terms of our, kind of what do we get up and think about every day? How do we end homelessness for good in the UK? Some context that, frankly, I think everyone on this call is already aware of. Local areas across the country are working hard, and they've made real progress in the last few years in terms of tackling homelessness in a really tough context, made only more complicated by the last 18 months. I myself started out in the sector in London, providing housing advice to people at risk of homelessness from the private rented sector around 2015. Really, really tough context, and what got me really thinking about what can we do to kind of get there faster and really kind of bring forward an end to homelessness. This is what the CHI's mission is. We're all about accelerating that end to homelessness by focusing on what works. And our inspiration comes from other fields of policy. If we look to medicine, we look to aeronautics, where real transformative results have been achieved by focusing, using empirical methods, thinking really, really hard about what the most effective interventions are, testing and adjusting, and really putting those into practice. So we believe that we, as a sector, as a homelessness sector, if we can shift our approach, be really ambitious in our goals, seeing that amazing change we've seen over the last couple of years of people talking about ending homelessness. We've seen that from the Welsh government. We've seen it from the Westminster government around rough sleeping. We're seeing in Scotland too. Shifting our approach to learn faster and to embrace experimentation. When we know something works, we do it and we scale it. When we're not sure, we experiment, we test and we adjust and we learn. And this will help us transform over the medium and the long term the experience of people who are homeless or at risk of homelessness. So how will we do it? We think this requires action on 3 fronts. So this really covers our areas of work. Number one, we need good data and good data practices. If we don't understand what's happening, if we don't understand what is, we're not going to be able to change it into what we would like it to be. We also need robust insight into what works for whom and where. So, I mean, for example, seeing the really quality insights we were getting from Harriet Watt earlier today around rapid rehousing pathways, really effective approaches which we know can move people out of homelessness quickly. And finally, the capacity to act on that insight. And that is actually what we're going to be focusing on today. So communities across the UK, local councils, individuals, organizations being able to have the skills and the tools they need to put that evidence into practice. And that is what our program is about, the What Works community. So what our experience has been is that leaders at every level across the country are really enthusiastic about using evidence to improve the lives of people experiencing homelessness, but their efforts are hampered by a lack of knowledge of what the evidence says and also the resources to use it. So the purpose of our program is to give local leaders across the country access to the support they need to understand what works where we know, and also to explore and learn and move towards things that we think might work, and that we think that can help people achieve real breakthrough results. And the goals of the program, it's about 4 things: helping areas become more evidence and data driven, and in turn, we believe that will help them prioritize what limited resources we have more effectively. We're always going to be resource constrained in this sector, so being smart about how we use it is one of the ways we can really accelerate progress. Embracing a culture of collaboration and continuous learning, and also linking that to nurturing leaders who are able to collaborate across silos. I'm sure that will speak to everyone who's here today about how silos and silo working, whether it's within councils or across agencies or across organizations, being able to share data and share information and share practices in order to tackle the problem is one of the ways we're going to make progress. Before I get into the detail, or well, actually, I'll hand over to Eric briefly to get into some of the details on the work we've done over the last couple of years. I want to talk about our own inspiration, our kind of our own evidence, so to speak. The first being the Research Schools Network. So this is a program set up by the Education Endowment Foundation, which is the What Works Centre for Education, and the Institute for Effective Education, who've created a network of schools and universities where you're creating that through line from the kind of cutting edge academic research, the best kind of cutting edge knowledge about what really works in terms of improving educational outcomes, and the classroom, and trying to improve outcomes for children across the country. And then secondly, the What Works Cities program, funded by Bloomberg Philanthropies in the States, which is all about helping local governments, mayor's offices improve their citizens' lives by using data and evidence to tackle the biggest challenges facing them. That's why I'm really thrilled to be able to segue over to Eric. So Eric not only has worked on the What Works community program, but was one of the founding team members of the What Works City program when it launched in 2015. So Eric, I'm going to hand over to you now to talk a little bit about the first couple of years of the What Works community program.
Awesome. Thank you, Rob. And I'm also very excited to be here to talk with all of you today, to just give you a little flavor of what our experience has been over the last 2 years of running our What Works community program. And so this all got started in 2020, and I participated in the first Evidence Accelerator pilot, which was our first step into really thinking through how we can, as a center, alongside folks like yourselves who are working on the ground, how can we build that capacity to use data and evidence effectively to tackle homelessness across the UK? So our pilot in 2020, as Rob mentioned, did include one pilot local authority in Wales, Pembrokeshire Council, and also one council from Scotland and one also from England, through an 8-month program in which we covered a variety of different topics, evidence, and skills in order to hand-in-hand work with local authority teams and co-develop this kind of material that would pilot a new way of working. So overall, our goal was for ourselves to learn about how to deliver that content, what skills were needed, what kind of things were local authorities seeing on the ground across Scotland, England, and Wales, and how could we actually participate in that as a center with the evidence and the knowledge that we have. So in the program, each of the local authorities defined their own specific local challenge to focus on. The overall theme that we tackled in 2020 was focused on the private rented sector, but each local authority was tasked with creating their own specific local issue to then pitch to leadership a new intervention that they were going to work on and pilot in their own communities following the Evidence Accelerator. So we all gathered for the first time. I actually participated in this as an outside presenter on data in Liverpool in 2019. This was very early in the morning, so everyone is looking as fresh as you might imagine at 8 a.m. for a start day. But we gathered everyone together in particular to get folks outside of their normal environments and really think through what it would take to build these skills a little bit, separated from your day-to-day, and how to make those skills stick. The three big areas that we focused on in the program were on data, design thinking, and behavioral insights. And to really bring insight to the partners and local authorities we were working with, we decided to work with and partner with three other external experts and kind of bring the best of the best to local authorities who are tackling these issues. So we worked with Johns Hopkins University, and that was actually how I got introduced to the program. I was working at Johns Hopkins University, focusing on data and local government. So through the program, we did data inventories to help folks learn what data they have, what they don't have. We also did a focus on data quality. How do you know what data you have that's good, bad, and then how do you improve it over time? Our partners at IDEO really dove into how to then tackle qualitative data. How do you design problems, and how do you use design thinking to solve those problems using qualitative data, using the information at hand? And we also partnered with the behavioral insights team to help inform policies and services in testable ways, in small touch ways that folks can implement on the ground quickly. So what I want to do is walk you through the experience of one of our partners, which was in East Ayrshire in Scotland, and show you how they learned throughout the program and kind of what they ended up with at the end through our pilot. So their focus was on maintaining and promoting tenancies in the private rented sector. And they came up with this challenge through our design thinking, through all of our data research, which was how might we encourage people to seek help before a problem becomes a crisis? Often in the private rented sector, what they were seeing in their community was that problems only came to them when it was a crisis, and then it was really, really difficult to manage any types of solutions in that situation in the private rented sector, which often meant you needed council accommodation or other types of accommodation, when in reality, most folks would have preferred that tenancy to continue. So their hypothesis was that by providing easy access to relevant information for tenants and landlords, we can prevent conflict from arising. And also then by providing mediation, if things do go wrong, we can keep tenants in the private rented sector tenancies longer. And so all of our program, probably I would say, if it was an 8-month program, 6 months we're getting to what is our problem and how do we actually develop a hypothesis that can address that. That's really, really difficult work. And at the end, they came up with this solution that they had drafted and presented to leadership, which was a web-based toolkit and landlord intervention service, which would focus on information and advice for private landlords, assistance for tenants, and then a mediation service to provide quick resolutions when conflicts did arise. So all of this at the end of the day was trying to encourage good practice, kind of, meet landlords where they were with what they need and what they want, which is how to get rent arrears in hand and how to maximize their income. They wanted to empower tenants to really enable them to take control of their situations and their finances. And finally, again, to provide that quick resolution and provide a neutral resolution to folks when there were conflict situations, so that it wasn't necessarily a crisis anytime folks were coming to them. So their goals through this program that we helped them to identify were first to kind of address problems sooner, and you see this along the bottom line of the slides, address problems sooner in the tenancy and shift the types of problems to less severe ones, again, so that folks aren't always coming in crisis. In the medium term, they wanted to increase their housing outcomes in the private rented sector, and particularly the perception of the quality of relationship between tenants and landlords, and make it not so combative, not so divisive, and get folks working together. And then in the longer term, their goal was to have strategic transformation where hopefully they would have fewer presentations of folks coming to them at all, because presenting as homeless, because they had a system in place to help prevent and then mediate disputes and keep folks into their private rented accommodation and having a vibrant private rented sector that people really trusted to deliver and meet their needs. So with all of these things in mind, this toolkit obviously is not going to be the magic wand that we'll wave, but it hopefully will help us to get to these outcomes using evidence and using the knowledge of the situation on the ground in East Ayrshire. So at the end of our 8 months, here we are again at the end. Before we were looking quite subdued. Now we're looking very celebratory at the end. And this was a culmination where all the teams did pitches to their leadership and the leadership of the other local authority teams on what their interventions would be and how they might go about implementing them in their local authorities. And again, we did this in person. This was a residential setting to get folks out of their daily work environment and get them kind of interacting in different new spaces. So what did we learn? We had 1 year, one pilot, as I said at the beginning of my portion. The goal was really for us as a center to learn about how this kind of work could be done alongside local authorities. And we learned 4 big things. So one was that demand for evidence and data is strong across all 3 of the folks we work with, across local authorities, across different teams, across the folks they were working with on the ground. There's a huge demand and appetite for this stuff. Small wins, though, even small wins are challenging to implement in this 8-month timeline. It seems like a long time to really, get yourself underneath the problem and think about a hypothesis, but it's really difficult to do in that time frame. And we need lighter touch ways to engage with more local authority partners, in particular on those core skills. So when we were talking about data and design and behavioral insights, those tools and skills are things that people can use repeatedly after the program is over. So we wanted to learn and think about how we can deliver those in lighter ways, in more effective ways to more folks. And finally, that teams crossing silos with support from leadership are key to implementation. And again, these are probably not, brain busting insights for anybody on this call, but for us, it was really important to kind of verify and validate what we were delivering, the demand for those services, and how we might deliver them to really, again, have the use of evidence and data stick in those local authorities and build over time. So that was year 1. And I'm going to quickly go through our experience in 2021, which, as you all know and might imagine, was quite different for a whole number of circumstances, COVID-19 being the number one, but many other ways as well. So we also decided in our next year, which I participated in again with the center, was to have our evidence accelerator, as you see, but also what we called the Evidence Academy, which was a different way, as we said, to kind of deliver that lighter touch support to more local authorities being the goal. So in 2021, we had some different objectives that we had put together based on our learnings in the pilot, which was to expand and scale up a little bit. How can we reach more than 3 folks and up to 20 being our goal for 2021, standardizing where appropriate, and again, focusing on that sustainability and impact locally in the long term. We also wanted to stay true to our core principles that Rob mentioned earlier, establishing better data foundations, creating a bit more extensive body of evidence, and strengthening the sector's capacity to act on that insight. And finally, as I said, as everybody had to in 2020, really adjusting to new conditions, whether it being COVID-19 forcing us to deliver remotely, as everyone did, but also as an opportunity to test new approaches. How can we actually deliver that training and core skills from a distance? How can we actually work with folks in a more sustained way? Because obviously we were not allowed to do any residential learning. How could we do it differently? So we had the opportunity to adjust and learn and see how it would work in a different way. So what we did that was different from 2020 was that we have the Evidence Accelerator at the top, which was the core program, that 8-month program, which we did instead of with 3, we did it, I believe, with 5 local authorities. But we also built the Evidence Academy and what we called our open community below that to create those lighter touch ways for local authorities to engage. If they weren't able to have capacity to go through the whole program, how could we provide interventions that were on time and meeting their needs in lighter ways? So we also were able to expand the program in 2021. So we had, as I said, 5 folks that participated in the Evidence Accelerator, but a variety of other folks that were also participating at various times in the Evidence Academy. So I was also really happy and learned a lot from the diverse group of local authorities that we had participating in the program. From very urban with Greenwich in London to very rural. Some other parts like Monmouthshire and the Highland Council are very rural. They need different things, and were we able to actually provide learning that would stick in all those places and meet their local needs was a great experience and experiment for us. So we had a really, really interesting time and really appreciated the efforts of the different partners that we had and different learnings that they had throughout 2021 as well. We also adjusted our journey a little bit. It was still that kind of 8-month journey for most folks, but we also kind of chunked out these different workshops. So you see the smaller bubbles within the slide are these different workshops on those core skills. So we had data, design, prototyping and sketching, and final pitches still, but we did them in slightly more spaced out ways to give ourselves a chance to test, but as well a chance for the local authorities to build more slowly instead of it being super intensive residential work. We also built and designed and delivered each of those workshops independently for the Evidence Academy. So that wasn't the long program. It was just folks coming in to do some skill learning and apply in their own setting. So this adapted journey was really key for us to help learn what types of techniques might work in our side-by-side co-development of work with local authorities. So I'm going to wrap up with just like talking through the experience in East Ayrshire, talking you through the experience in Aberdeen, which was one of our participants in the accelerator in 2021, who focused primarily on supporting young people who present as homeless. And again, their question to focus was how might we reduce the number of young people, particularly age 16 and 17, that represent as homeless. In their evidence, their data, their work, knowledge of the context on the ground in Aberdeen, this was a key challenge that they thought if they could get this right, try to figure out how to prototype some solutions here, could actually have really, really big long-term benefits. So I'm going to talk about that in just a second. So with them, through that kind of chunked out process, as I said, that was a little bit more spaced out. We started with what does the data tell us in Aberdeen? And now this is one slide with 6 little bullets on this. This is a lot of work for teams, as you all might imagine, to be able to do. And in particular, I want to focus your attention on the temporary accommodation and the failure to achieve housing outcomes component, because those are really key parts for our partners in Aberdeen, where they saw that over half of the 16 and 17-year-olds they were providing services with go into temporary accommodation, which is not necessarily what they wanted. And 40% of or almost 40% were not helped to a sustainable housing option or supported accommodation. They were representing, they were coming back to receive additional services from the council. And they wanted to see if they can reduce that number, then they'll have really big long-term dividends in terms of those individuals coming through the system, but also their experience in the long term with the council and their services in homelessness provision to be able to help their relationship over the long term. So another new thing that we did in this experience is we actually had every local authority go and do interviews and create journeys for folks that were experiencing their services. And this is something I encourage all of you to think about doing, is how can you actually get in the shoes of folks who are on the other side of the table from you and are experiencing those services. And so each of the local authorities, in addition to gathering quantitative data that we just saw, did a lot of qualitative data gathering. And so Sarah, this is not a real name, it's an anonymous person that they've rebranded as Sarah, presented as homeless in September after being asked to leave a family home, going back home, came back to the council twice for assistance in 3 months. And on the last presentation, went into temporary accommodation for 3 months, now doing well in supported accommodation. So this journey was something that was really important for the teams to think through, as how do they actually present, how do folks experience their services, and to really get them outside their own mindset a little bit into what they're doing. So with their quantitative data, with their qualitative data, the folks in Aberdeen came up with a solution to provide continued sustained services for the 16 and 17-year-olds, in particular focusing on people, bringing in folks who understand and work with young people regularly. So what might those underlying needs be? And really focus on building relationships with families, with the young people themselves, and with their support networks to focus on long-term housing solutions. And again, for them, this was about addressing that underlying need, which often is driving this particular young people to come to the council for services. So their goals were to then have some investment to fund a bespoke team to work with a small number of young people who are leaving the homelessness process. They wanted to be able to be proactive to ensure safety and well-being by really working with folks trained to work with young people, maybe more so than other folks on their teams might have been. And again, focus on that building relationships with other services and with the young people themselves to allow early identification and intervention and really prevention in the long term. So their overall goal is this kind of reduction in repeated homelessness presentations in that target group, young people, and reducing the amount of them that go into temporary accommodation as well. So on our side, after 2 years running the program in very different contexts, what did we learn? That there's a lot of data out there. Again, this demand is high, but it's hard to unlock the potential. Understanding what data is relevant in what places is really key. And really understanding your challenges and problems and defining them well is a key part of that as well. That the structure is key, that the opportunities to try new things and make improvements are constrained by our existing structures and systems. We do want to get back to trying to get folks a little bit outside of their normal workspace because it can be constraining, and getting folks to think differently is really, really challenging for everyone. So how can we structure that well? We also really wanted to have a tailored focus on problems and matching that to the existing evidence gap. So a lot of our work in 2021 focused a lot more on the front end, defining the challenges, defining the problems better, and then actually mapping that to the evidence that the center can provide and translate among them. You have a problem, here is the state of the evidence in that area, and what can you do in your local area to address that problem? And finally, important versus urgent. LAs see the value of working and using new tools, changing business as usual, but that business as usual often does get in the way, and there are operational pressures, there are transformation processes, funding cycles, global pandemics, whatever you have will get in the way of that. And how can we find, again, these lighter touch ways to embed that in people's work is really important. So after 2 years, you can see a really quick snapshot of our journey. We're really proud of the work we've done, and particularly so happy to see the results in the work with folks we have partnered with. But we've worked with over 120 policymakers and practitioners, over 30 local authority teams in some very intensive, some lighter ways, designed and implemented 7 interventions, and piloted this service delivery, as I said, in both intensive residential in-person formats, as well as online settings. So we feel really good about the things that we've learned ourselves over the last couple of years and through the partnerships with local authorities and experts. And we're really looking forward to translating that into some new ways of working and new ways of partnering with folks like yourselves in the future. So with that, that quick snapshot of what we've done over the last couple of years, I'll hand it back over to Rob, who's going to talk you through what's coming next and what we've learned, how it informs what's going to be coming down the pike for us and for all of you in the next year. So Rob, over to you.
Thanks very much, Eric. And just to say, from my part, having joined the center in the last sort of 6 months of the tail end of the 2021 program, it's been really sort of amazing for me to get to grips with the work that the local areas that we have been kind of partnering with, the quality of the thinking, and the kind of, in the context of these councils managing the COVID pandemic, going on these learning journeys, coming up with completely new interventions. Speaking to Aberdeen City Council, are just at the point where they're about to start rolling out their new intervention to help their local youth, young people experiencing homelessness. Catching up with East Ayrshire a couple of days ago, where they are still using the design thinking tools which they learned on the program, but to apply to different areas across their housing services, so not just within their homelessness teams. So, really the power of kind of the work that Eric and the team were doing really coming through even sort of 18 months later. So I'm going to talk a bit about what's going to happen next. And starting from today, we're thinking about the big question, which is about an end to homelessness across the UK. So it's a really exciting, and if you ask me, a really crucial time to be working in homelessness in Wales, but also across the UK. Prior to joining the centre, I was working in the UK Treasury, working on the Westminster government's rough sleeping manifesto commitment. This is once in a generation time where this question is on the table about how we make homelessness rare, brief and unrepeated in Wales, and where we end it in the rest of the country. Now, we're really excited and thrilled to see that framing also coming through, because that aligns with our vision of homelessness becoming rare, brief and unrecurring. And we're also thrilled about the work we've been able to do with the Welsh Government, where their recently published action plan, the 21 to 26 action plan, draws on our SHARE framework and some of the evidence-led approaches that you heard about earlier. Now, this is a really ambitious goal, and to make it real, everyone working towards it, anyone in the sector, all of us doing that work, will have to find effective and lasting solutions to the issue. And also, we're hoping to see a change in the conversation around homelessness in the country. Moving away from that conversation we've been having since Cathy Come Home, where there's a little bit of the poor will always be with us when it comes to homelessness, and actually saying, like, it doesn't have to be, and we can get there where we have eliminated homelessness in this country. And you don't need me to tell you, anyone to tell you, that this is not going to be easy. We already heard from Glenn and Harriet Watt earlier today about some of the context and the kind of demand figures we're facing. Street homelessness continues to rise in Wales, and we expect to see more demand coming down the track, and similar ongoing pressures in terms of temporary accommodation. So this is the kind of the scary slide. This is the one I call the scary slide, where, in terms of what the task is going to be, we in the sector are looking at delivering a significant commitment under time pressure for potentially growing homelessness population, where we actually don't understand the problem as well as we could, thanks to our current data collection systems. We don't have that rigorous evidence on what will work. If we take this, for example, of like last year, when we didn't know whether a vaccine for COVID-19 was possible, and now we are, we're still there in terms of homelessness. We have lots of things with much better evidence base, so we did, but we still don't have that detailed understanding of what works, at what cost, where and when and for whom. It's all about those, going from the macro level to the micro, that individual person and what will work for them. So that's the context. So we believe, and I think everyone on the call probably also believes too, otherwise they wouldn't be here, that it is possible. There's no magic formula for ending homelessness, but if we look to other fields where transformation has occurred, humility about the size of the challenge and determination to solve it, and also particularly better methods, we can make this change. So we're thinking about this, and there's a lot of things that are out of ours as practitioners and policymakers' control. I think it was Amelia earlier who referenced, local housing allowance rates. That is something that is not within our control as people working on the ground or in organizations in the sector. However, there are three things that we definitely can control, three enablers. We can adopt a clear definition of what success looks like. We can actually think about what would it mean to have ended homelessness in Wales. We can develop success measures, ways we will actually be able to measure that change is happening, and also be able to tell when we're achieving it. And then building from that, we can get it set up to deliver and foster the cultural change needed in order to do that. So whether that is kind of designing our systems around achieving goals, refining our data collection processes, using that data effectively, and thinking around the person, using those things like design thinking in order to design interventions that really work for the person. So on that first question, what do we mean when we say we've ended homelessness? Do we mean absolute zero? Well, as an ambition and as a rallying cry, then that is absolutely where we should be. We should always be talking about ending homelessness. But in terms of absolute zero, no person is sleeping out without a home ever. The evidence does suggest that's probably not something we can practically achieve. And is that realistically the goal we're working towards? When we think about the services we run and the thing that we want to achieve, are we always going to have someone who has an argument with a partner and spends a night on another person's sofa or in a car? Probably yes. Are we going to be able to develop services that are able to stop that all the time? Probably not. Are we going to be able to end homelessness in a more kind of granular, particular way where we'll be able to measure our progress towards it? And what would that specific measurable goal look like? I can already see someone coming in the chat there with the direction of our thinking. So like any transformative change, you have to begin with a vision. So for us, that is a society in which homelessness is prevented wherever possible, or is rare, brief, and non-recurring. Now, the thing about visions is they have to be translated into measurable goals. There has to be that golden thread between the vision and the concrete specific measures of success. I'm going to ask you to hold this visual in your head for a couple of minutes. So that clear definition of success, working from the vision to the goal, to the indicator, and to a success measure. Make homelessness rare, brief, and non-recurring. Make that specific, make it rare. How do we define making it rare? How will we measure it? The number of people sleeping out on a given night. And then we maybe set a goal. Now, we've been working on this around how would you create that definition for the Welsh context? And we're working on a kind of example of what that might look like. So there's a lot of detail here. This is a work in progress. Be interested in any immediate reflections, but the idea here is mostly in the frame. Homelessness is ended when it's prevented wherever possible, or it's otherwise rare, i.e. you're seeing fewer than 2 people per 100,000 per night sleeping out. That number is either 0 or below that very low number. And you're seeing a low level of homelessness applications. And you're seeing an absolute limit in terms of the number of days between someone's first contact being bedded out, night out, and the final contact before they're moved into first night accommodation. And then you get similar metrics around use of bed and breakfast or unsuitable TA or other forms of TA. And on that recurrence thing, we do set real ambitious goals around the number of people we see coming through the system multiple times. So I suppose one of the questions is, well, what does this mean for local areas? What does this mean for people working in local councils or in organisations across Wales? So we're looking for local areas who want to work with us to co-create data-led definition of ending homelessness on this model to try and accelerate an end to homelessness at a local level in Wales. So we're already working with 7 organisations, 7 areas in England and in Scotland. So we're desperately keen to find somewhere in Wales that we would be interested in taking this approach, thinking really, really hard and really empirically about what success looks like and driving towards it, and to work with us to pilot that. So while setting these kind of meaningful, ambitious and measurable goals is critical, that is going to be a necessary ingredient to success in our eyes, the other pieces of the puzzle are equally important. So, that evidence around what will work, what cost, when and for whom. And those sort of data systems to understand what's working and to scale it when we know, and when necessary, identify what's not working and change it. So that's why in 2022, we're expanding the What Works community offer considerably. We've got support from Comic Relief to do so, which is fantastic. So the program now has 3 levels. So in terms of that intensive level, those trailblazer partnerships where we're looking for partners to pilot data-led definitions of ending homelessness in your area, that is where we're bringing the whole expertise of the CHI and our partners to bear to try and kind of articulate what those goals means and get those areas set up to deliver. Really inspired by some of the work done in the US on this front by the Built for Zero campaign. And then our impact accelerators. So basically, this is about taking some of those key ingredients of our capacity building work from the accelerator programs in the last couple of years and making those as nimble and accessible as possible for as many councils as we can work with. So in terms of deep dives on the latest evidence and skill areas, so there'll be workshops on key evidence areas and also on those areas of data literacy, design thinking, behavioral insights, and also opportunities to collaborate with other people working to end homelessness with evidence. So things like we are recruiting evidence champions within organizations who want to champion this approach, and also peer learning chapters where people facing similar issues in different locations or working on similar themes can learn from each other, guided by the evidence. And we're also looking to launch our open community where the idea of this is some of this stuff will be available online. As a simple problematic for us, we're a small organization. There is no way we can work with every single council in the country or every single organization in the country, but we want everyone to have access to this kind of information. So we're going to be launching an online offer next year. Which leads me to the final slide, which is say thank you, and also to invite you to sign up for the What Works community for 2022. Sign-ups are open now. You can sign up on our website or drop me an email on rob@homelessnessimpact.org. Really excited for questions, and also today in advance, thank you very much for having us.
Thank you very much, Rob and Eric. That was a fascinating presentation, and I think a really timely one, because we've got, as you said, the Ending Homelessness Action Plan. We've got this ambition that's set out in the programme for government and elsewhere about ending homelessness, and very much the shared definition of rare, brief and non-recurrent that you guys use in the centre. But I think that was really helpful in terms of thinking about what sort of measures might be used in order to mark that, because it's all well and good rolling out that sentence every time we speak about ending homelessness, rare, brief and non-repeated. Well, what does that mean? What does that look like? And I think the work that you're doing at the centre is really helpful in terms of trying to move that from, I guess, a bit of a slogan into something that's meaningful and that people can work towards. And just to say to the audience that the centre's involved in one of the task and finish groups that's working with the Welsh Government on the strategic outcomes framework as well. So really grateful for their input in that. So please do, we've had some fantastic comments in the chat, but please do submit some questions to the Q&A. I've got a couple of questions here. So I think one of you talked about the role of leadership in the local authorities that you've worked with. And I guess, you know, local authorities are big organisations, and there's lots of different areas of leadership, isn't there? There's the sort of political leadership of the elected members, the councillors, then you've got, you know, very senior corporate leadership, and also service level leadership that's specifically looking at homelessness. And what's your reflections really on the role of some of those leaders in the local authorities that you've worked with, and how have they helped to drive forward some of the work that you've been doing?
Eric, do you want to maybe give some reflections on the community so far? But before that, I mean, one of the ways we are thinking about how kind of you create that change in terms of transformative results in public authorities is that you've got to think, for us, it's thinking differently about what each person at different parts of that delivery chain needs. Now, if I'm honest, like, you know, when we're working with leadership, so we're working with CEOs of councils or we're working with members, you know, we're not going to sit them down in a workshop and tell them all about the detail of rapid rehousing pathway. What we are going to do is trying to get them excited about what the meaningful reality is. So say, for example, that work I was describing on a data-led definition, it's about getting them excited about the definition, thinking it's possible, and actually saying that the role of leaders at that senior level, so leaders at every level, can play in terms of holding that definition, holding that something up that the whole local area can sign up to, and actually being the convening power. And if they can grasp the power of being able to say, this is the direction of travel, this is the ambitious but achievable goal we want to set, that has been really, really powerful in terms of unlocking those conversations. So we've been having those conversations with the Mayor of Manchester and also with West Midlands Combined Authority and with also groups in Glasgow. So those high-level strategic conversations being really, really engaging. And Eric, I think you probably have some reflections also about the kind of the linking together of the different parts of the kind of the system when it comes to trying to do new things through the Accelerator program.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think through the program, we've seen that each of those layers is really important to engage at the right time with the different pieces of evidence, data, whatever you might bring to bear. And that our experience with the program is that working with most folks who are managers or commissioners is kind of our core audience, but their direct bosses, usually housing directors and folks like that, are really critical to bring in quite regularly to keep folks updated on what they're doing. And those people generally get really excited about the potential of the specific interventions. But it's also, as Rob said, really important to manage even further up in the chain to make sure that there's commitment for follow through, right? And so in the both runs of the Accelerator program that we did, that kind of pitch to leadership at the end, which included the chief executive of the local authorities, was really critical. And that's something actually that the center that we actually can help bring, because if you are a commissioner and actually our partners in Aberdeen said this, I'm not going to have the power to bring the chief executive to a meeting about some prototype that I've developed, but we can do that. We have a convening power and an ability to kind of bring some of those folks to the table. So I think being able to kind of triangulate those things was really, really critical for engaging leadership.
Great. And in terms of thinking across the programme and the local authorities you've worked with, have there been some common barriers that have been a feature, across the piece really? So, I suspect capacity is a big one, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'll go first on this one, and I'll Rob fill in the gaps. But in my view, there's probably 2 or 3 major things. So one is that, capacity in particular in the last year, everyone is super stretched thin, and there's just not time in the day to kind of carve out these spaces where we're going to try something new, and really it's really difficult to do. So that means for us at the center, we have to be even more intentional. We have to be even more kind of laser focused on getting things into folks' hands at the right time. That's going to be really impactful. So that's why, as Rob mentioned, we're kind of piloting some of these newer methods we think will help with that. I think another big challenge that I saw is like in terms of the methods around data and design, like it seems kind of complicated. And I would say most folks in the sector would not consider themselves experts in those things. And I think that it can be somewhat, it can put folks off from trying, but it's not that hard actually, and it's not rocket science. And actually with some like quick tips and tricks, like you can go a really long way. As Rob was saying, our partners in East Ayrshire are continuing to use those skills in other areas. So for us, it's been like, how do we get past, the folks that might say this isn't for me, but it's actually quite accessible if you put a little bit of time to it. So those are kind of the two big things that I've seen across a couple of years. And I know Rob, I'm sure, has other insights kind of coming into the program now and where he hopes will go in the future.
The big bugbear for me is implementation. It's actually doing it. It's hitting the tarmac, like going through what I call like the valley of death, which is where you can have a great idea, you can workshop it, you can be led by the best data in the world. And, it is that thing where anyone who's worked in a service delivery environment, particularly in the statutory sector, like actually doing stuff is really hard. There are so many processes, there are so many barriers, there are so many norms. And even with the best will in the world, even with a CEO jumping up and down saying, I want this to happen, life gets in the way, or structures get in the way, or computer says no gets in the way. And that, we sometimes don't pay enough attention to that, but that's the really hard stuff. Thing is, like, often we know what works, it's actually doing it. It's going from the decision to do to things actually happening. So we're actually working with an organization called Delivery Associates, set up by Michael Barber, who led the Prime Minister's delivery unit under Blair. And his whole thing is, how do you, as different people within a system, be able to pull the levers that we have? Those of us not doing frontline work basically have pieces of paper on a screen to move around, and that's how we make stuff happen. And actually thinking in a more intentional way about, how do I get from A to B to C to when I'm actually delivering the change and actually helping people? And I'd say that's the toughest thing. So that's one of the ones we're grappling with.
And what do you think are the critical success factors or enablers, either that you've witnessed when you've been taking local authorities through the programme, or things that you suspect are going to be important as you move forward?
Laser focus on the goal and on and how you're going to measure it, how you're going to track progress over time. People talk a lot about data, and that they assume that means having lots of numbers. Is often you don't look. Most councils particularly actually are quite data rich because they have a lot of statutory requirements. It's about picking the ones that matter and mapping them onto the thing you're trying to achieve. We talk about meaningful, measurable, and movable indicators. Would moving this thing create a really meaningful outcome for our citizens, our residents? If we move it, then yes. Otherwise, we don't worry about it too much. Is it movable? Can I, from where I'm sitting today, do something that will change this number? And finally, is it measurable? Like, do I have data that can measure it? So setting the goal, having simple data that tells you whether stuff's working. Because then if you do that, then when you try things, you get that feedback loop of seeing whether it's making that change. So I think those are some of the things that people, particularly in kind of like more managerial or commissioning or strategic roles, can think about.
Eric, did you have anything to add on enablers or success factors?
I mean, I would say the biggest shift that we saw from folks in particular through the programs that I would say is, enabling their success is a kind of cultural and mindset shift around the willingness to pilot small ideas. Like, you don't have to have the big idea. Small ideas are good and actually really, really helpful if you have that laser focus, as Rob said, to test and see what's working and have that mindset of actually testing, prototyping, trialing, as opposed to a kind of, the system is what it is kind of mindset, which, was not really necessarily what, we set out to do in each of our sessions, but ends up being really, really critical in the long term. So I think that kind of that mindset shift will continue to be important and really helpful to kind of engage different partners, different members, different layers of this system that Rob was mentioning. We need the paper pushers as well as the service deliverers, as well as, you know, the decision makers. We need all those people to be working in coordination, and that mindset shift is a really important part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, touching on what Rob was saying about measurements, I guess we've got a real opportunity in Wales with the establishment of the strategic outcomes that we're looking at, that's part of the recommendations of the Homelessness Action Group, and that the Centre is helping the Welsh Government with, but also that balance in terms of some of the data we collect around the housing support grant, so what was supporting people, and certainly getting the balance right between collecting meaningful data but not overwhelming support workers with hundreds of indicators where they spend more time with their heads in a spreadsheet than they do focusing on the support delivery. So I think that balance is really important. And the other opportunity that we have in Wales, and it's really great, Eric, to kind of hear you say, you know, it doesn't have to be the big idea, it can be smaller pilots and interventions, because last year we had an increase in the housing support grant of an additional £40 million. And the tricky thing in our sector is we're always keen on having extra money, but sometimes it comes as a bit of a surprise or with very short-term timescales on it and knowing what to do with that. But, you know, potentially there's lots of learning that local authorities and partners in Wales can take with some of the smaller pilots that you've done working with local authorities, where they might be able to do similar pilots with that additional funding. And, you know, we've got a draft budget that gets published in a week, and hopefully that budget will at least be maintained or hopefully increased, and that gives local authorities in Wales an opportunity. And you were saying, Rob, you know, there's an opportunity for local authorities in Wales to get involved in some of your programmes going forward.
Absolutely, we'd really welcome that, given the context you've just described, and particularly the kind of the clarity of the vision and the kind of which is coming from government, but also you're seeing as at the local level. We think there's a real opportunity to kind of trailblaze some of this work. You know, this is the critical time, the next like 3-4 years. You know, this is, speaking plainly, you know, this kind of level of resource is not consistently available when it's coming from central government. You know, there is a real kind of enthusiasm and a real focus on results here. So it is the time for, you know, councils and organizations to be thinking big about what they can achieve. And we're really excited to kind of be there to try and provide that kind of evidence and data lens. We're not as much of a prescriptive organization as we might come across sometimes. We're mostly about trying to introduce different ways of thinking about problems and ideas about what might work. So we're very open to partners approaching us to say like, well, we liked this idea. What if we did this? And we want to go, interesting. We want to hear how that goes.
Great. My other question was about the role of other partners as well. Something that we've seen in Wales throughout this pandemic is the importance of partnership working when we needed to respond really quickly and really effectively to getting people inside and getting people safe. And you know, your work is with local authorities, but actually their partnerships with whether it be other statutory services or the third sector, it is really important. Do you have any reflections on the importance of those partnerships in the What Works community work that you've been doing?
I was reflecting on this actually with some analysis and interviews we were doing with a council in England, like a large city council in England, and about actually they hadn't really thought about it, but the fact that prior to the pandemic, you know, in terms of their relationship with their commission providers, they spoke to them sort of once a month, maybe once a quarter, mostly to do quite procedural sort of contracty type stuff. Now they meet every week remotely, constant engagement, the real-time data flow is really strong. The kind of alignment on, you know, actually the relationship between what's going on the ground and the kind of decision making at the council level and the strategic level within these organizations has really improved. And that would not have happened were it not for us all suddenly having to learn to use Zoom very suddenly at a very basic level. So those kind of, so there's been a lot of innovation over the last 18 months, and it's about kind of recognizing that where it is. So, you know, hopefully you'll see organizations trying to do a bit of active reflection and actually thinking about, oh, what have we done differently? And probably to be surprised at quite a lot. And that it's sort of, there's definitely some learning there. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I was thinking about that, the opportunities to work more with partners through some of the often quite simple innovations we've all had to go through in the last 18 months. And certainly in my limited interactions and experience, you've seen quite big changes in terms of that proximity between the VCS and local councils.
Yeah, and I'd also add kind of two different points on top of what Rob was saying, like that through the, in particular, the pilot, and then a little bit less so in our focus in the second year, like we did work with at least one third sector partner in each of the local authorities. I just remember off the top of my head in South End Dundee was their local Peabody, housing provider that was at all of our workshops, participating in all the discussions, like actually working together on the same problem. Was actually, really interesting way for them to learn about each other's work and get beyond kind of that procedural relationship that Rob described. But I also think that in particular, as we go forward next year with these kind of lighter touch engagements that Rob was mentioning, like evidence and skills sprints, those skills are extremely transferable to the third sector. And we very much welcome people to participate, directly in partnership with us. Of course, we want them and are very happy about that increase in partnership at local areas. But we also hope that those folks can connect potentially better with each other in the third sector and with us, because those skills are the same. That we're all going to need to kind of be working towards these big lofty goals that we're setting for ourselves.
Definitely. And, we are very happy to circulate information to our members when those opportunities arise and encourage that involvement and engagement. And I'm sure that many people at the conference today would be really keen to do that. We're getting near to the end of the session, so I think we'll finish with one quite critical question, really. And so at the moment, and I think you've reflected on it, local authorities have been working flat out for the past 20 months, trying to get people off the streets, trying to keep people off the streets, keep people safe. And it's been really, really tough for colleagues, particularly in local authorities and in frontline support services. And the numbers in Wales are pretty scary, 6,900 people in temporary accommodation. And, it certainly feels like there's a huge challenge ahead of us. And I guess sometimes it's easy to think that stuff on data and systems is the nice to have stuff, and we don't have the capacity to do that. And it is really hard when local authorities and their partners are constantly firefighting at the moment. So what would your message be to, I guess, those in the audience who are feeling really overwhelmed with, not only the numbers in temporary accommodation, but the strategies they're having to write and everything else that is kind of pressurizing down on them? What would be your message about some of the work that you're doing and how that could help rather than hinder or add to the burden?
I'll speak to my own experience there, actually, as someone, my own experience of being in the sector and then in central government and then coming back. What drew me to the centre, and the reason it got me excited and willing to go and do another really hard job, having done a previous hard job and actually fancying a break, was the value of the vision. That actually saying, like, actually, this is an organisation that's all about meaningfully ending homelessness. It's not about managing homelessness and not about tackling homelessness. And there's sometimes reminding yourself that's why we're here. And that also the only way that you're going to know whether you're getting there is with these tools. Like, if we don't have the indicators, we don't have these ways of measuring, they can seem dry. And if they are feeling dry and like you're just doing them for compliance, it's asking the question of what am I being asked this information for? How does this help? Those two different things where there's management information to make sure you organize your service properly. Yeah, that's important. But the really, really big critical stuff, like, are we driving down those temporary accommodation numbers? Like, that number matters. And sometimes being reminded that actually doing the work and getting it down, if you imagine that world where we actually have got much fewer people in temporary accommodation, we aren't seeing people on the streets, that would be quite extraordinary, but it is within reach. So for doing that stuff, we're going to get there by drawing on these kinds of techniques, and that it's going to be hard to know when we've got there if we're not doing it. So for me, it was thinking about the meaningful goal and knowing that you can measure it and knowing you can track your progress towards it. And that's what drew me to work for the centre. So I hope that resonates somewhat with colleagues when they're doing their data returns and they're thinking like, well, at least we'll know when we're getting there.
Yeah, and I would just say that, I see these techniques with data, evidence, all of that as kind of force multipliers. We often have this distinction between working hard and working smart. I know everyone's working hard. I don't think it's a distinction to make at all. But if we can just, have these tools and techniques that actually enable us to do more with that capacity that we do have, whether we're having new infusions of, cash or not, how can we actually multiply and make our own time, more effective at driving that number down, as Rob said. And I think, making a little bit of time for that can go a long way, in my view. So I see it as kind of this, working smart it's an investment and that will pay off in the long term. And hopefully that's a way that folks can get themselves motivated to make the time to do that in very, very challenging situations. And I hope we can all do that together over the next year, and hopefully we'll have more time and space to think about those kind of questions.
Thank you. Oh, Rob, do you want to add something else?
I realized I want to spell one thing out, which is I realized maybe it wasn't clear in that final slide, inviting people to sign up. The community is open to people in the voluntary sector as well, organizations in the voluntary sector as well. It's not exclusive to local councils. I just want to really, really warmly invite colleagues from the community sector to get in touch. So I realized
Fantastic.
that maybe 100% clear.
That's brilliant news. Thank you, Rob. That's been a fantastic session. So informative. Some really thoughtful things in there, some stuff that we're going to go away and reflect on. And most importantly, I think huge opportunities for the sector in Wales to get involved with the centre, to work with you, to move towards that ambition of ending homelessness, and importantly, knowing that we're getting there and when we've achieved it. So thank you so much to Rob and Eric for a fantastic presentation, some brilliant reflections from you in the Q&A. We're really, really grateful for your time today. That was the penultimate session, folks. So we'll be back in 15 minutes where we'll be hearing from the Institute of Global Homelessness, and we'll be hearing from their director, Lydia Stazen, who will be talking about the work they've been doing across the globe to support different cities in all sorts of different situations to tackle homelessness. So I hope you enjoy the next 15-minute break, and I hope to see lots of you at 3 o'clock. Best wishes. Thank you very much.